I'm Kayla Isabelle, the Executive Director at Startup Canada. The entrepreneurship ecosystem 3 months ago was dramatically different than what it is right now. But what we've seen over the last couple of months is that Canada's entrepreneurship ecosystem is still very diverse. So we're seeing an increase in women, newcomers, visible minorities, those that identify with disabilities, and really seeing growth of Indigenous entrepreneurs. But what we're seeing at the moment is obviously a dramatic shift in sustainability, in feasibility of sort of starting up completely, or just sort of keeping the lights on. So we've seen our entrepreneurs be incredibly challenged by COVID-19 in ways that, I think we could have anticipated in some ways because of the ecosystem being so fragile in its initial stages. But obviously in terms of revenue decline, we're seeing a significant shift there with our small businesses that already had incredibly tight margins and minimal access to credit. And we're seeing losses across every major sector. So those that are offering professional services, social assistance, education opportunities, contractors, everything across the board. So Startup Canada's membership base is very diverse in terms of industries, and we've really seen that impact across the board. But I think the biggest thing that we're seeing at the moment in terms of the impact of COVID-19 is the lack of protection and support for our solopreneurs or the sole proprietors and those that are really at the infancy stages of their businesses. 54% of our membership have zero employees. They have zero paid employees. They might use contractors or other suppliers. But we're seeing a major gap in support for those groups and sort of falling through the cracks with a number of the government subsidies. We're also seeing some challenges with our pre-revenue startups. There has been some traction to provide them with additional support. But of our membership, almost half had under 100K of revenue last year. So they are already in a challenging financial situation, and that has really been exacerbated by COVID-19. I think the COVID-19 economic response plan has really been essential, and we're seeing its rollout have tremendous uptake. And the federal government, I think, has really done an excellent job from a communications perspective, ensuring that cadence of communication and trying to provide Canadians with up-to-date information. I think what we're seeing and the biggest challenge from the Canadian government's response to this economic crisis are these entrepreneurs that are falling through the cracks that don't qualify for these government subsidies. Many of our entrepreneurs have expressed this concern, especially with these sole proprietors and solopreneurs and pre-revenue enterprises. So that has been a major gap. We're seeing the 75% wage subsidy that has had incredible traction in keeping staff on the payroll, at least for the interim, as organizations can begin to pivot and offer either different business offerings or look to the future of their organization under this sort of COVID-19 light. But until those funds come in, we are seeing a tremendous amount of anxiety. And in terms of cash flow, these government recommendations are coming, assuming that our entrepreneurs can wait until the beginning of May. Many organizations have, almost 2 weeks of cash flow to keep their organizations afloat. So they're not going to make it to those times. So I think the government response has been really strong, but in terms of speed, we need to be even faster and ensuring that we have urgent cash flow flowing to these smaller enterprises as soon as possible. And I know that, it's a Herculean effort to get this underway. And the federal government is doing a tremendous sort of job in connecting to those entrepreneurs. But I think that in terms of timing, we need to see things move faster and see those emergency funds allocated to solopreneurs and sole proprietors. I think allowing businesses to defer their GST and HST payments, that's been really helpful. And that's been, we've been doing a number of startup chats and events that connect, TurboTax and other tax support organizations to ensure that there's clarity on how to proceed with their either deferral payments or shifting those spaces. The Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program that was announced last week is a great initiative, but we are hearing a lot of feedback that it is too restrictive. So the minimum thresholds of monthly rent are too high for many of our small businesses. So we're going to need to see a more inclusive plan roll out that is not as limiting. We're also seeing with the Canada Emergency Business Account, CEBA, with interest-free loans to small businesses and those financial supports, that awareness of these offerings is very high at about 80 to 90%. And we have conversations with our financial institution partners on a regular basis to get this information. But of those that they're surveying within their client bases, about 20% of those qualifying candidates have some level of hesitancy about applying. And so that, I think, is a really interesting piece that we need to drill into a little bit more to understand if there's a lack of trust with the financial institutions, lack of trust in these government support initiatives, and really getting to the bottom as to why our entrepreneurs might not be using the supports that are in place to support them. We're seeing great investments in the Industrial Research Assistance Program, and that has had incredible traction. And I think symbolically investing into the innovation economy is fantastic. But we really need to look at these smaller entities and these mom and pop institutions that will not survive COVID-19 without an immediate cash flow support from the Government of Canada. So I think that's where we really need to be investing heavily. We're already seeing the startup ecosystem evolve, since day one of COVID-19. I think we saw immediate, pivots of businesses, especially, in the restaurant industry. You can see, shops across the board offering takeout and trying to adjust their business models. Also going digital. We're seeing a number of entrepreneurs either leverage what was initially a small service offering that they had digitally that now is occupying more of their revenue space or investing more heavily in the digital. But really, when we look at our entrepreneur base at Startup Canada, 20% of our entrepreneurs had no revenue in 2019, and 50% had under 100K. So these groups are not in a financially stable situation, which will compromise their ability to weather this storm and to pivot their businesses because they're already working in a deficit situation. I think with a number of the fantastic examples that we've seen in distilleries shifting to selling hand sanitizer, or especially in the health space and health tech space, we're seeing unbelievable innovations that are coming out. But those groups generally are fairly well funded or have other institutions that are backing them. So I think we need to look at those success stories and celebrate them. And, we have an upcoming Canny Awards with the Innovators and Entrepreneurs Foundation that we're launching at the end of May and throughout June, celebrating entrepreneurs, celebrating these pivots and these demonstrations of innovation. But some organizations can't do that. If you're offering a service that either can't go digital or you have no runway to even attempt to pivot your business, we're going to see those businesses decline completely. So I think over the coming months, having that cash flow influx immediately will support them to try to identify ways to pivot. But looking long term, I think we're going to see a moment where we need to start up Canada again. We need to start, thinking about what our future looks like as a country and as a world post-COVID. What is the event landscape going to look like? What is, the large gatherings of groups may be a thing of the past. So how can we leverage the digital space, connect in new ways, identify new product offerings and new spaces to invest heavily into. But I think it's almost too soon to know what that looks like, but I can assure you that entrepreneurs will be the ones to figure out what the future economy will sort of look like in that space. We're going to see the entrepreneur community activate, and that's a strength that entrepreneurs have, that they are willing and able and feel that passion and that energy to sort of propel themselves forward. But we need to make sure that they're also supported along that journey. In a first instance, we are going to recognize post-COVID how essential entrepreneurs and how crucial they are to the Canadian economy. So I hope that realization does not come too late, that we see almost this secondary wave that without our startups, there's then going to be a subsequent sort of ripple effect that then we don't have scale-ups and then we don't have these larger institutions. So I think hopefully we can get ahead of that so that we're preventing this future loss of the startup community, and the potential for employment that, we know many of our small businesses employ part-time, full-time, contractors, freelancers. We need to ensure that there are jobs at the end of this, and startups and scale-ups are going to be places that are going to be able to hire, hopefully, post-COVID. So when we look at the new organizations, we need to really be investing in those startups to ensure that they can expand and bring in additional now unemployed Canadians into the fold. I think looking at entrepreneurial campuses within universities and colleges is going to be really essential because what the job market looks like post-COVID is going to be very interesting, and we don't know what that's going to look like. But if we can really incentivize students to start thinking through and coming up with solutions to the challenges they're seeing in their evolving world, and embedding that entrepreneurial mindset into these institutions, we're already working with Colleges and Institutes Canada to have these conversations and think, how can we really encourage entrepreneurship as a viable career option, especially post-COVID? So having those students sort of advance and think about entrepreneurship being a next step for them post-grad in the absence of other more traditional jobs that could have been in place pre-COVID. And I think really supporting entrepreneurs with education opportunities, connection. What we're seeing right now is this pan-Canadian conversation. What used to be, localized into major urban centers, and we have startup communities all across Canada that have really focused on that local perspective, which is very important. But we now have this Canadian conversation about entrepreneurship and innovation. So post-COVID, I hope that remains, but hopefully we'll be able to identify more innovative solutions to solving these challenges. Just like we saw with our startup weekend last weekend, there's so much power in bringing together these minds across regional spaces, increasing diversity, increasing this sort of community building approach. I think there's tremendous power in that. I think post-COVID as well, thinking of how we congregate in-person spaces will be dramatically different. And seeing, with landlords and even just practically within office spaces, co-working spaces is a key component of many entrepreneurs' sort of social space. So that'll be interesting to explore. But I think really providing this soft landing space for either startups that are starting up brand new, coming out of university, or those that have had to rebuild their organizations. Startup Canada is going to be at the forefront of that conversation and making sure that they have, a soft place to land and one spot to come to for information about the new accelerators and incubators that could be coming up, post-COVID-19. What other support functions can the government of Canada provide to make sure that space is really well resourced, to make sure that we are supporting them, because if we don't support them, then we're going to see this ripple effect happen year over year and ultimately impact the Canadian economy as a whole. So I think we don't want to get to that point where we say, coulda, shoulda, woulda sort of thing. So we need to really demonstrate how essential and how fragile the startup ecosystem is now and will continue to be unless there's commensurate support in place. In terms of our corporate partners and looking at industry and how they can support entrepreneurs, we have been partnering with a number of different private sector institutions. We actually have a private sector leadership advisory committee that congregates quarterly with Startup Canada to connect the voices of entrepreneurs with industry. I think in this environment, looking at the power of private and public sector partnerships, that I think is a really unique space. And we're already seeing that evolve, which is really encouraging, that hopefully the lines will be more open to communication and those types of partnerships in the future. And I think really the feedback that we get from entrepreneurs is reduce the red tape, make it more accessible, make things, easier to understand, even in just how we position the language. And I think we're seeing major shifts with our industry partners to go in that route, and go where they already are. I think it's partnering with groups like Startup Canada that really have that connection to the grassroots communities that industry is coming to us to ask to get access to the entrepreneurs, but also the feedback loop has to happen the same way. So we really encourage those types of conversations. But I think it's reducing the barriers, and specifically on the finance side, year after year, our entrepreneur community says that financing and barriers to financing is the biggest challenge that they face, either in sales, cash flow, identifying, different types of revenue spaces. So working with the banking groups and working with financial institutions to build both financial literacy post-COVID and during COVID will be essential, but making sure that they're hearing some of these challenges that entrepreneurs are facing across the board within finance. But I think really post-COVID, encouraging this private sector partnership, private-public sector partnership ongoing will yield some really positive results. I think from a communications perspective, the federal government's been doing an incredible job. So lessons in communications, in my former role and my other hat that I've worn is as a communication strategist. So seeing that come to life, I think, has been great. And there's a lot of lessons in leadership that we're seeing from our federal constituents and from leaders of private sector industries and of small startups that I think there are a tremendous number of leadership lessons that we're seeing on the ground. So overall lessons, I think more so a point than a lesson will be the fragility of the startup ecosystem. That this could be a hard lesson to learn if we don't get this right, of supporting our startup ecosystem and our small to medium enterprises over the coming weeks, days, and subsequent post-COVID. That could be a lesson that is a hard one to swallow once we see those ripple effects, if there's not commensurate support. I think from a transparency perspective, there are lessons to be learned about listening, but also responding and really demonstrating that we don't just have our ears open, but we're ready to act. So I think from the federal government, we're seeing, we have daily calls with the ADM of Small Business and Marketplace Services. Startup Canada is doing weekly town halls with local MPs and their entrepreneur ridings. And so that listening exercise is incredibly important, but we're going to need to see turnaround and action that is moving quickly. And we know that there is speed, but if we see some of these innovations that are getting turned around in a week, we can also kind of expect that type of turnaround with other industries. So I think lessons in terms of delivering, listening, but acting and really thinking, what is the 80% solution here? Like, we don't have to get this 100% right, but how can we move the dial and move things forward urgently, because we are in an urgent situation with our startup communities. I think learning that we need to support every entrepreneur at every level could be a challenging lesson that's learned also potentially too late. We can't just be investing in, specific demographics. We need to look holistically and look across the board with various industries, various stages of revenue, the types and numbers of employees that organizations have. We can't just bet on the fastest racing horses. We need to really be providing support across the board. So I think that lesson, hopefully we can learn now, and that demonstration can really be impactful at this moment, and we don't get to a stage where it's too late. And I think really the importance of community is a lesson that we're seeing people gathering in unconventional ways and digitally. My voice hurts after talking so much on the phone and connecting with so many different entrepreneurs and our partners every day, which is beautiful and great that we've now opened the door to having conversations that we haven't formally had, and connecting in a really meaningful way, of being vulnerable and sharing. I think everybody's in this, COVID is almost this equalizer across the board, that everybody is affected by it. So coming into this conversation, people are much more open, and they are really putting their hearts on their sleeves here, that their organizations are at risk, and they want support. So I think we need to really tap into that vulnerability, recognize that, and really support that, because they're coming to us. So we really need to be able to provide appropriate support, because they're asking for help. With Startup Canada's membership, we have already seen a tremendous uptake specifically for social enterprises and social innovators. So about 40% of our memberships identify as social entrepreneurs. And that means, connecting to our UN Sustainable Development Goals. So if we are seeing that connection existing within our startup ecosystem, I think that was relevant pre-COVID and is especially relevant post-COVID, that we're not just keeping them afloat because they're a small business, they're also trying to do social good and sustain some type of social impact in the long term. So I think it's by supporting our startups, we're also going to be supporting our social innovation economy, and really making sure that our global crises, climate change is still going to be an incredible challenge. We're still going to see a number of challenges in terms of inclusivity, and making sure that we are responding actively through the businesses that we build. But I think it comes sort of twofold. If we're investing in our startups, many of our startups have already gone in that direction. In terms of inclusivity, over 50% of our membership are women. So really supporting marginalized women is something that Startup Canada is actively working on. We're partnering with the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce. We've done a survey that is really getting feedback from underrepresented founders and from marginalized groups to identify how COVID-19 has provided, an additional level of extreme challenge for their businesses. We know that these marginalized communities have so many barriers to entry already, and now this additional layer has made things exceptionally challenging. So we're doing a series of surveys and a series of small group roundtables to give a platform for those marginalized communities to have a voice and connecting that to government. So I think in how we consult with the entrepreneurship community, making sure that these marginalized groups and those voices are heard will be a part of our process and has been implicit since day one for us, making sure we have that inclusivity, we have diversity of perspective, and that all of the recommendations we make to government have all of those voices heard and embedded into those asks. But I think it comes down to recognizing Canada's incredible diversity. I think that's foundational to who we are as a country, and it's also foundational to our entrepreneurship ecosystem. So we need to be supporting all of those marginalized groups now more than ever. I'm Kayla Isabelle, and this is My Future Economy.